into our discussion today on boundaries. Boundaries is a hot topic in most all professional industries, but this week we are really highlighting how to set up healthy boundaries in the CAC movement to keep yourself healthy, to keep your staff healthy, to keep your mind and all of the things healthy in order for you to do the work. So we're going to talk about boundaries. I have fabulous folks that are joining me today to help engage in conversation, kind of a roundtable, real talk scenarios about boundaries. So I will introduce our group and we will start with Greg.
Hi, everybody. I'm Greg Flett. I'm a Senior Program Manager with the Southern Regional Children's Advocacy Center.
Great. Thanks for being here, Greg. And Jimmy.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jimmy Whittyfield Jr. My pronouns are he, him. I am the Project Director for the Training and Technical Assistance Grant at the National CAC, and I'm also a licensed professional counselor in the state of Oklahoma.
Great. Thanks for joining us, Jimmy. And Karen.
Hi, I'm Karen Hangartner, and I'm the Director of Professional Services at the National Children's Advocacy Center, and my pronouns are she, her.
And last but not least, Andra.
Hello, everyone. I am Andrew Chamberlain. I am a child forensic interview specialist and an instructor here at the National Children's Advocacy Center.
Great. So my seasoned professionals, I haven't added up the years, but I think collectively amongst all of us, we have well over 100 years of experience in the CAC world, which we could probably talk about boundaries for days. I'm Christina Rouse. I'm the CRC Program Manager, focusing on CAC development, and we're going to talk about boundaries. So I think we can all agree that in the CAC industry, it is a unique space that presents itself with diverse situations, and boundary setting is very paramount. Healthy boundaries helps us build trust, not only with our staff, but also our MDT members. So when we get into talking about boundaries, I wanted to think not only about boundaries as it relates to individuals, but maybe as full staff and also MDTs, and then also as our organizations. So to kick us off, when you think about boundaries and boundary setting inside the CAC, what are some things that come to the top of your mind as scenarios that you might encounter as it relates to boundaries? And Karen, I'm going to start with you because you've had lots of experience at all the different levels inside CACs.
Yeah, and I think talk about a learning curve. I think boundaries are something, and having clear boundaries and honoring those boundaries are something that I've struggled with over the course of my career. And I'm coming up on 20 years at NCAC. And kind of what we see across, the CAC world. I think for people, the idea that if I try to maintain some rhythm between work and life, that kids are going to get harmed if I am not accessible 24/7. I can remember doing a secondary trauma workshop at a conference, and I heard some people who were in the workshop talking about we're on call 24/7. And I'm like, whoo, that doesn't feel sustainable to me. Because what does that mean for mental health and time to recharge and all of that? And then ironically, the same session was repeated and their supervisor was in there. And their supervisor was talking about, this works really well for us. And so I do think there is this tension between how do we have healthy boundaries for folks around work, workload, work hours, and management, that we have funders that are demanding XYZ. Where is that kind of, what's the right kind of magic workload, caseload kind of thing that we're trying to figure out? It shows up all the time in any kind of listserv. How many forensic interviews can a forensic interviewer do in a healthy way? Well, that's asking about boundaries, right?
Yeah.
And so there's this tension between what's in everybody's best interest, and then management decisions around how do I fund that if funders only want to fund XYZ. So I think I am on a journey of trying to figure out what healthy boundaries are and how I honor those in a way that allow me to do the best work I can do for kids and families.
Yeah, because when we think about boundaries, it's really setting up what's okay and what's not okay. And so not only do you have to do that as an individual, what's okay with me and what's not okay, but then if you're a leader or a supervisor, you're also setting up those boundaries around your organization. What's okay for my organization and what's not okay in order to keep the work sustainable and continuing. So Jimmy, I'd love to hear your thoughts about just boundaries in the CAC setting and how that might be unique than other scenarios.
Sure. I think I probably have the least experience with children's advocacy centers compared to my colleagues that are in this discussion. So maybe it's a little bit more unique, or maybe I'm just a little bit more naive. Probably the latter. I think about multidisciplinary teams that I've supported and CACs that I've gotten to know and now working at one. I think boundaries, particularly this year, have been really at the forefront. As we're all kicking off kind of goals for the year and thinking what life is like at this stage in our point in space and time, where I've seen some challenges in CACs around boundaries have been with mental health folks that are there, either a part of the MDT or within the agency, and struggling with how much information to share on a current client, mental health client, that's also being served by the CAC through investigation and other services. And something that Karen said made me think of this, in that we all want to be helpful. And so it's hard sometimes for some people to remember there has to be a boundary here for confidentiality and privacy. And I think that extends to, to our professional working relationships. So it doesn't always have to be, a professional and child, and confidentiality in that relationship. But really just knowing how much to share, when to share. I think my experience working on, being in the field and being a part of many different kinds of teams, is people having those boundaries where they share more openly about their personal life, or they're sharing a lot of details about their professional life, most of which isn't relevant. And so there may be no harm done there other than the amount of time and emotional labor it takes to take all that in. But often I think it can be counterproductive when boundaries are so diffused that there's information overload. We know too much about someone, their personal life, how that can make us uncomfortable. So, that's where I see a really interesting challenge, is just how much people share either professionally or personally.
And Andrea and Greg, I'd love to hear your thoughts on kind of what things come to the top of your minds when you think about boundaries in the CAC setting.
Well, I've had several additional thoughts since listening to Karen and to Jimmy, and to go back to what Jimmy says. So Jimmy coming in to this work from, as a therapist and with that mental health background. And, one of the challenges that we often see in a children's advocacy center, when a child comes in and there are multiple red flags and everyone is concerned and they're worried, they're concerned about this child, or we wouldn't be in the field if we weren't concerned about children. But then when the forensic interview is conducted and there's not a disclosure. And so often what members of the team will do or say, well, let's get the child in therapy. Let's see if they can develop that relationship with the therapist. And then if they disclose in therapy, then we can conduct another interview. And I think that it's unfortunate that there's not more of a boundary around that issue, that we do not send children to a therapist in the hope that we gather or we gain a disclosure. That's not the purpose of a therapeutic relationship or environment. And the hope that, gosh, if a child goes to a therapist and then if they make a disclosure, the team wants to rush in and conduct another interview. And that's unfortunate because with that disclosure often comes a building over time of trust with and relationship with that therapist. And just because that child may disclose to a therapist at some point in time does not mean in any way that they're ready to have a follow-up, forensic interview. That needs to, the idea of that follow-up interview needs to be introduced by the therapist, and they probably need some additional sessions to prepare a child for an interview. But I do see that as there's multiple issues with boundaries in a CAC, but it's definitely one that we see quite often. And it is, the purpose of that is really to, okay, we want to protect this child if someone's harming this child. But it's unfortunate because it stretches the boundary between that confidentiality and the reason for that therapeutic, having that child in that therapeutic environment in relationship. And that's where we often see challenges is between that need for investigation and protection. And then what does the child need, which hopefully the therapist in that relationship is providing. And it's definitely a boundary that often gets challenged, I think, within a team.
Yeah, I love that you brought that up because sometimes we tend to think about boundaries for ourselves and then we overstep that boundary in the different roles that our MDT members bring to the table. So I love that you brought that up, Andra. And speaking of MDTs, I'm sure Greg has lots of insight on MDTs and boundaries.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me because we see this come up so many times on multidisciplinary teams, and the impact of really not tending to these boundaries or talking about these boundaries is so profound, and yet we see very little intentional discussion or exploration about it. When I think about boundaries, like the basic definition I have for myself, it's a set of rules that I use to protect myself, keep myself safe. And on multidisciplinary teams, what's really interesting is each one of the disciplines that is represented on these teams have a different set of rules, right? They're playing by a different, playbook that if we don't take the time to discuss, talk about, really clarify for each other, that's where we see ourselves kind of running into each other and crossing those boundaries without really knowing it. And sometimes it's like smaller logistical things like, oh, this detective keeps calling me at 7 o'clock at night without realizing like, yeah, he's got the 4 to 11 shift, like he's working. Or, this therapist keeps asking me about my feelings, and that's not part of the rules. Like I have rules about that, and we don't do that in my discipline. So small things like that are things that I think if multidisciplinary teams were, just a little bit more intentional around, if they took some time to recognize those differences and talk about them, we'd see less boundary violations, if you will. We'd see less crossing of those lines without recognizing the impact.
And Greg, how does that make you feel?
A question never to ask at an MDT meeting or a case review meeting.
I know.
Well, and I can tell you somewhere right now, my partner is grinning ear to ear because if I hear one more time, this isn't therapy. Our walk around the neighborhood is not a time to have a therapeutic conversation. And speaking just as a mental health provider, someone who's done therapy now for a couple of decades with children and teens, like, some of my career habits bleed over into my personal, right, and other professional roles. And so, Greg, your point's really well made. I mean, we're kind of living our careers 24/7, and how that might pose those boundary issues.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we can all agree boundaries are hard, right? They're difficult to navigate and it's not easy. And even if we think we have set up really strong, healthy boundaries in maybe our personal life, to your point, Jimmy, that doesn't necessarily mean that we have really strong, good boundaries in our professional life. So why is it so hard to set up boundaries in the professional workplace?
Oh, I'll jump in here. I think part of it in the CAC world, whether it's a CAC or a chapter, we're trying to be responsive to the needs of whoever we're serving. So if I'm a CAC, I'm really trying to be responsive to the needs of my MDT, or I'm trying to be responsive to the needs of the kids and families that we're serving. If I'm a chapter organization, I'm trying to be responsive to the needs of my member centers. And so when you're trying to be all things to all people, or you're trying without any real good thought and intention about what you're trying to accomplish, that's where those boundaries can become really mushy. And so I think that's one of the reasons it's so hard. People come to the CAC world, I believe, because they really are trying to make a difference in the lives of kids and families. And so when that's kind of the lens we're bringing to this, I think sometimes we think that we have to sacrifice all in service to that, to that mission, to serving kids and families. And I think that's where we can get in real trouble. And we see incredible burnout on the part of some of the professionals that we work with. I think that's where we see mission creep from organizations. So I think it's just hard, like you said.
Yeah, and I wonder if a part of that's not that we've been kind of programmed to really go above and beyond. We've been rewarded as we've come up through our careers, whether it's in school or in our first jobs. The message has been for a long time, you put the extra hours in and you'll be rewarded for that, with a promotion, with a raise, with a pat on the back. And at some point, there's a point of diminishing return where, doing that extra work doesn't really serve us and doesn't allow us to serve those that we're trying to help in really positive ways.
Well,
I'm sorry, Christina, but I don't know if y'all are familiar with the work of Pat Fisher. She did some videos for us around STS. Greg, to that point, she talks about that somewhat being generational too. And I think that's where we see some tension showing up in the workplace, is because folks of my generation, that is how you got ahead. You worked 50, 60, that was rewarded. Overfunctioning was rewarded. That, in fact, it's how you got ahead. These newer generations, they're not willing to do that. And I think, quite honestly, that's really good for us to take notice of and to think about.
Yeah, Karen, I was just going to say the generational piece, but also just personal experiences in our culture and our backgrounds and how we were brought up and how we lived in our personal life. I come from a military family, and if you weren't 10 minutes early, you were late. And if you weren't the last to leave, you were in trouble. And so just really, what are those things that are ingrained in you from where you come from, or what your lifestyle was like? And then how are you bringing that into your professional career without really good, healthy boundaries can be damaging as it bleeds over into burnout. But I'd love to hear, Andra, you're still doing direct service in the field with MDTs. So what are some struggles you're seeing with setting up boundaries with teams currently?
It's interesting. Over 27 years, I sometimes feel like I've seen and heard it all and experienced it all. And, what I do find, and especially I think with newer interviewers, is some of the struggles that they face as they come on and they're developing a relationship with the other team members. So they're new, and especially if the person that they're replacing, or that if they're being added to a team, if they don't do exactly what the other person did, and if that other person really had weak boundaries or couldn't say no, or and then if this new interviewer comes along and doesn't exhibit that same behavior, may experience some pushback from the team. Well, why won't you do that? The other interviewer did that all the time. Why won't you ask this question? Or why won't you come in after hours for an interview when it's clear the child is protected? It's not going to serve that child to come in at 2 a.m. in the morning if they're 4 years old and they're protected. But hey, the other interviewer would do that. Why won't you? And that is something that we see quite often. And with either new interviewers, or perhaps maybe it's a tenured interviewer, but they're new to the team. Perhaps they've changed CACs, and so they're new to the team, and so they're developing that relationship. And I certainly think that either the program directors, executive directors, they set the tone for boundaries within the CAC, not always with other team members, but definitely for the people that they are over and they provide supervision for. That if that person has challenges with boundaries, then that is going to trickle down, and your interviewer is going to have trouble. Another issue with team members, I think that we often see, and it's funny because we often hear stay in your lane, stay in your lane. And that's a team member saying, hey, my lane is investigation, yours is to talk with a child. Don't tell me how to do my job. And there's times when, as an interviewer or just as a team member, you get frustrated when you feel like everyone's not giving 100% to this particular case or this investigation, this child. And I think I know I've been told, Andrew, stay in your lane. That's not your lane, because I want to push against that. And it's learning to have those discussions, because I think everyone comes to this work, and different team members with different agencies, we have different lenses on the same issue, the same view. But just we're looking at it through different lenses. And if we can't develop a way to communicate and to talk with one another and honor what everyone brings to that investigation, we're going to have issues. We're going to have challenges. I do think, though, that there needs to be someone within that team, and certainly Greg can speak to that can guide those discussions. But it often needs to be someone with some experience, either with that team or someone that that team views as, they have a right to speak. So, and that can be really challenging, but that is definitely an issue that with our mentoring and consultation groups that we do, that issue is recurring every year that we have a group. We're going to be talking about that particular issue and trying to work with some of the interviewers, because this is a struggle for them. It truly is hard for them to negotiate that relationship with the team and setting those boundaries. And I think it's sometimes difficult for me, because after being in the field for so long, I don't have any hesitation with saying, let's really think about that. I don't think that's the best way to go. Other people that are new, they're not going to feel that they have the ability, or if they do, they may not feel like they have the support from their supervisor or director.
It's funny you mentioned that, Andra. So we talk about facilitators a lot in the work that we do at SRCAC, and one of the qualities we look for in a good facilitator is, we use this phrase, boundary spanner, someone who's able to really bridge that divide between these disciplines. And what helps them to negotiate those challenges, they kind of speak both languages, right? And they can reach across and build relationships across that boundary. So it's interesting to use that kind of description of somebody who can help, in that middle space, make sense of it on either side.
Yeah, I wish, Greg, that we had them in the monitoring room when we came out. We were checking in with our team, to see if there's additional questions, because that often comes up at that time. Team members are wanting us to ask inappropriate questions in the interview. We need a facilitator then.
So I'd love to pitch this to Jimmy to close us out in regards to why setting boundaries can be so difficult, as our mental health representative. Like, why is it hard to set boundaries?
First, you've made a terrible assumption that I'm qualified just because I have a degree and license in mental health. Let's start there. I think in my opinion, what makes boundary setting so difficult at any level, local, state, national, or regional, right? Leadership versus frontline worker versus admin, right? Any of that, is that setting boundaries is uncomfortable in a lot of ways. I think, my friends here on this call and some communication we had by email earlier, identified ways that they set boundaries and seem to be fairly comfortable with it. But I think for many people, it's a balancing act. There are some boundaries that are easy for us, but many of us, I think, struggle. I grew up as a young person with a mother who was an immigrant from Germany, who rules were very important to her. It was very important to fit in to American culture, and for her, her children. We were born here. For her parenting to be solid, and so we had very clear boundaries about how we addressed people, what we said no and yes to, etc. And I realized that as an adult, I've carried that in with me. And it's very hard for me to tell people no, or it's really hard for me to stick to a time boundary for my schedule, or maybe boundaries around my travel or other things, because I want to be helpful. I was raised to always try to be helpful and polite. And that means sometimes just taking an easier way, which makes me less uncomfortable, right? By not adhering to a boundary. So others in this podcast right now have talked about wanting to be helpful. Ultimately, we know we're in it to help children be safe, happy, and healthy, and setting boundaries that cognitively make us think that we're somehow interfering with reaching that goal, then just become just uncomfortable. And so we tend to be more loose with those boundaries, or not have them at all.
Yeah, it's almost like we need to redefine what it means when we set up those healthy boundaries. Like, having healthy boundaries at the CAC does not mean that we're not going to be serving kids, or that we're not going to be good team players, or that we're not going to be putting out quality services. It really means that we're setting up boundaries to keep ourselves healthy and sane and resilient in order to be sustainable for a long period of time in the work that we do. Because we know right now in the work field, turnover is rampant, and we're trying to keep really good workers in the CAC as long as we can. And healthy boundaries, I think, is a good way for us to keep them where they need to be. So we're going to kind of shift a little bit into, we did a little field analysis of what the hot topics were around some scenario-based things that people are experiencing around boundaries. And so we're going to do some vignettes, and then we'll use this group as our panel of experts for feedback and guidance on how you would handle these scenarios. So we'll start with, and it's kind of a direct service related, and Andrew, you already mentioned these a little bit, but we have MD team members that at times maybe overstep their bounds, or maybe take advantage of personal relationships that they've built with CAC staff members, whether it's an interviewer or an advocate. And sometimes they use that personal relationship to ask for special privileges, as it might relate to maybe wanting a forensic interview that's outside CAC case criteria, or after hours interviews, or maybe they're asking a family advocate to do something that's really not inside their scope of work. So when those things happen, what would be the best way to handle that scenario?
I would hope, Christina, and this goes back to really looking at your organization, what policies are in place. But if it's clear, like in your memorandum of understanding with your team members, that this is what constitutes an after work interview or a crisis interview, and we're going to triage any cases that come in after hours, and it's not going to be just the investigator and maybe the interviewer on call, but we may be reaching out to supervisors, so that if there's any question that, I might need to get another pair of eyes on this, or I think that that's important, because that can cut off some of that pressure. If, hey, you have my home phone number or my cell number, you can call me after hours, but I'm not the interviewer on call. I can tell you that it's not going to meet the criteria, but hey, we can patch in, Linda or Kim, and we can dialogue about it. I think having that would help quite a bit to cut off that type of crossing over the boundaries. But again, it's going to be, that interviewer is going to need to know it's okay to say no. May not be comfortable, but not only is it okay to say no, but hey, I have these policies that I can refer back to, and that's going to support me in this decision making. What I would also say, and I would hope every interviewer would have the relationship with their supervisor, that if they felt like a team member was taking advantage, that they could go and talk to their supervisor, and perhaps on a supervisory level that could be handled. We have issues crop up against every team, and certainly we have them here where we've had some challenges with different individuals, and you try to address it one-on-one and have that discussion. But if that doesn't work and issues continue, then if it's in place, that next you go to the supervisors, and then the supervisors have a discussion. What I will say, just as a final thought, I think it's absolutely key that teams have the opportunity, funds are available, monies are available, to go out of town to a conference, because you're all together, you're eating dinner together, you're attending classes maybe separately, but you're coming together through that travel, through that, in the evenings. And that's where so many of those relationships are really honed, is through that personal connection, where then you feel like, hey, yeah, that's not going to work. That's not what we do here. But if you don't have that opportunity, it can be challenging to develop that relationship. And I know with much bigger CACs, they have multiple teams and people coming from different counties and different cities, and that might not be possible. But part of my wish is that for new interviewers is that there could be, I don't know, a webinar, a seminar, that they could be told that it's okay to have boundaries, that it's perfectly okay, and it's healthier if you do, that if you really enjoy this work, you will stay with it longer if you can develop these boundaries. But a lot of interviewers, they need help with that. And there's that, they're not going to get that in forensic interview training. That needs to come from somewhere else, but it would be nice if we had something for them.
Yeah, I love that you're lifting up that kind of, we don't want to create bad practices, right? So interviewers obviously don't want to create bad practice in how they interview. Everyone inside a CAC doesn't want to create bad practices without setting up healthy boundaries. And when you talk about leadership, I'm going to kind of pull Greg in here a little bit about how leadership teams can really support these issues of discourse that might arise when it comes to overstepping boundaries as it relates to MDT members.
Yeah, that's one of the things that we're really looking at more and more in multidisciplinary teams is, where does the seat of kind of influence, power, and control lie? And how might we, recognize that and utilize those leadership roles a little bit more intentionally to address these challenges when they do arise, but to Andrew's point, really create systems and structures that prevent them from becoming conflicts that need to be addressed. When we talk with leaders on multidisciplinary teams about, boundary setting and, guidelines, rules, whatever you want to call them on multidisciplinary teams, we say early and often, right? Really target new folks coming onto these teams early, so they understand and they appreciate and recognize these boundaries, and then repeat often what these boundaries are. And that will help us to really prevent it from rising to that point of conflict, or require a intervention or a facilitated conversation at some point. It's a shame. One of the sayings that we have in the MDT world is the best way to learn what the rules are on a new team is to break one. And you'll be told real quick where those boundaries are, right? They'll set you straight. If we can prevent it from getting to that point, we can really do not only the team a service, but really the team functioning a service in the long run.
Great. Okay, the next scenario relates to chapters. So CACs are at all levels in the community, local centers, state chapters, regional, like Jimmy mentioned, national. So the chapter board, your chapter director, chapter board maybe continuously ask the state chapter director to take on projects or maybe new programming that does not fall inside the chapter's strategic plan and capacity. So maybe it might be in the plan, but maybe capacity is an issue. So how might one handle being a chapter director, getting pressure from a board to take on more things than they can at this time? And I'm going to pitch this to Karen.
What a great question. And I think for this, part of this is a lot of education for the board, because they may not come from an organization or a place that's being very intentional and strategic about what things that they are offering. I do think too that for chapter and chapter boards, it could be that that chapter board member is also a CAC executive director, because that exists quite a bit across the country as well. And I don't know how many times over the years that I've heard chapter directors talk about, I'm doing exactly what my CACs asked me to do, or they wanted this. Now that I'm giving them this, they forgot that they asked for it. And so they're asking for something different now. And I think that that's the nature of the beast. And so whether it's a board member or the board member's a CAC executive director, only the chapter director has a really good bird's eye view of what's actually going on and what the big picture looks like. And so for a chapter director, constantly having to remind and educate the board on what that looks like. And like we previously mentioned too, so much of our culture rewards over functioning. And so this idea that as a chapter, we're going to be intentional and strategic, which means that we may be doing fewer things better, more in depth, than trying to do this really, wide inch deep kind of approach to things. So I think educating and helping shift those paradigms for board members and also for member centers probably as well. And also as a chapter director, you kind of got to trust your gut around it and feel pretty grounded. And we have this strategic planning process. We feel really good about what we've decided to do and where we're headed. And so we can trust in that work and stay kind of focused and avoid shiny object syndrome, which I love a bright, shiny object, right? But how do we develop some discipline around, here's the work that we did, here's our intention, here's how we're moving forward. And it doesn't mean that we can't get to that eventually, but it's just not right now.
And I think too, one of the things I heard our coworker Corey always say is that if people are saying yes to this, what are you saying no to? So if you are picking up more things and adding more things to your plate that aren't in scope, what are you essentially putting down or saying no to that actually should have stayed on the plate? So
yeah,
about that.
Yeah, and I think too, I remember working with a chapter organization on a strategic plan several years ago, and the conversation was, every time we do a strategic plan, we're adding all of these member benefits and services, but our capacity is not necessarily increasing. And so it was kind of like, are we capturing our current work? And every year we're not just adding all these new activities, but we're not increasing capacity, which is back to what you just said. If we're going to add this, then how do we add this while we're still delivering all of these current services?
Yeah, really kind of understanding that more is not necessary and it's not always better, even though it might look better on paper, it might not be better in the quality of services you're offering. Great. Okay. The last scenario we have is, and this is more as it relates to organizational structure. A supervisor or leader or executive director sends emails. Don't raise your hand if this is you, by the way. Sends emails after hours or on the weekend asking questions of staff and then getting upset with staff when they're not responding or getting back to them as soon as they send the email. So Jimmy, I'll pitch this one to you. How would you handle that scenario?
You know what I like about this question is that it gets to the culture of an organization. What's the culture that's being set? And several people have already mentioned it's the tone or expectation set by the executive director or the more senior members of staff. This is something I think that happens quite frequently. I know that I have been in situations where I'm getting emails at all hours. But I've also been the person sending those emails. And so how I would respond would be to know what my own boundaries are around when and when not I'm checking my own emails and just being okay with that. But then also communicating with the other person about you want a response from me, but this isn't when I am on, right? Quote unquote on. So I'm not going to respond. I would probably explore too when there needs to be some flexibility because I know that urgent situations arise, and having a little bit of that flexibility, but also establishing like this isn't the norm for me. I'm not checking my emails at 8 o'clock at night. I learned from someone I think I can call a friend, I know I can, and a colleague, Brian Miller, who has this great model of supervision within secondary traumatic stress. And I learned from him that, at 5 o'clock, it's not like we turn off our work brain and tune into our home brain, right? And at 8 a.m. the next morning, we're not flipping that. When I'm at work, I'm thinking about my personal life. When I'm engaged in my personal life, I'm thinking about work. And so there are times that maybe like I'm so stressed out about something that I want to send a quick email. But I'll be mindful about it. I'm not expecting a response from someone if I'm sending it out of traditional work hours. And in some ways, I've learned some tricks. One just recently about working offline in my email server. So I can still respond to emails, but nothing goes back until I come back online. And so it doesn't provide that layer of stress to someone. If it were me in the situation, I would have that open, honest communication with that person, understand what the limits or boundaries, parameters are, and explore ways to still be able to do my work, but it not add to the stress, right? Or the expectation for someone to not stick to their own boundaries.
Yeah, I love that. Any other insight on this scenario that we can probably agree that we're guilty on both ends, maybe at one time in our professional career?
I'll just say that one time I did talk with a supervisor about this. And I did it because we had a relationship that had a very high trust factor. And this supervisor had just not thought about that implication. They in no way expected a reply, but I was able to say, I know you well enough to know that's exactly true. You're not expecting anybody to work outside of this. However, there's still a power over power differential, and they may feel compelled to respond in a way. And it was a very positive conversation. So I think, some people are naturally more adept at some of these boundaries things than some of us. And so having somebody that you have a high degree of psychological safety that has your best interest at heart, sometimes it's okay just to have the conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Jump in really quick because Karen, you made me think of something. As what the work world is changing, right? 8 to 5, Monday through Friday, is no longer necessarily traditional for a good portion of the workforce. And so it's forcing us to think about what these boundaries look like. I don't want to work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. But other people have different lives, different schedules, and they may be working. Like I forget who gave the example earlier of a law enforcement officer who's working like the late evening, early night shift, and they're trying to get their work done, and how that could be misperceived of you're asking me to do something outside of my normal. So how do we get all of that to line up, particularly as things are changing rapidly within the workforce, and how we're getting our work done and when we're getting our work done?
Yeah, that brings up a thought that I had, when we're talking about, creating the culture of your organization and hiring new staff, like as either the person hiring someone or the one going for the job interview, asking those questions about the culture of the organization. What are the expectations? And really looking for that alignment of, is this a place that's going to fit with how I want to work and how I'm treated at work? And so really having those clear boundaries, I think from the very beginning during the hiring process is key to communicate, not just also when the issues come up down the road. Okay, so we're going to kind of wrap us up. And in the last couple of minutes here, I think it would be good for the field to kind of learn maybe some of the things that we've learned professionally in our experiences about setting boundaries, and then some tips and tools that we can leave the group with to maybe the things they can take back to their workplace and try to help them set up their own boundaries. So, Andrea, I'm curious, how have you seen setting up boundaries for yourself at work positively impact your ability to stay in the field?
That's a great question. And I think about when I started in the field so many years ago, because I was very guilty of, always having my phone handy, or back then it was the pager. So I'm dating myself, but, just always being available and not really truly thinking about how that impacted my home life or my family. And only at one point for my spouse to say, when I was literally coming here and saying, are you going to work as much as you did before? Are you going to not be available to me? Really is, in essence, is what he was saying. And it was just this, really, it was a strong wake-up call for me that I needed to put stronger boundaries into place. I needed to honor my time away from here, because one, that made me fully present with my family, but then it also meant that I was more intentional about the way I spent my time at work and the tasks that I had to do and the deliverables. So I think it's understanding that you could give 150% of yourself to your job in this field, and it will never be enough. And that the field is not going to collapse if you set boundaries and you take time for yourself and your personal interest, your family, because if you don't do that, you're not going to have anything left to give.
Yeah, that's great. Greg, what about you?
I think in large part, setting healthy boundaries has helped me really move to where I am in my career. I've only ever quit 2 jobs, and both of them were over boundaries that I wasn't willing to be flexible around. One was working in a setting where the safety precautions that they put in place for kids that we were treating were just not up to what I had as a personal boundary. And had I stayed there, I won't go into the details, but it would have been a bad situation. The other one, I worked for a for-profit organization that wanted me to wear a suit and a tie every day to work, and it did not mesh with my values, with my boundaries. And they were not an organization that was accepting of family work balance. And I think it really helped me to recognize it was not the end all be all of, I didn't have to stay in these positions for the rest of my life and be miserable. It really was choosing my happiness in the long run that helped me to do that. So it's helped me to get to where I am.
All right, Jimmy, what are things that you've seen positively impact by having good boundaries?
It's short and sweet. It really reduces my anxiety. It just, when I know what the boundaries are, mine and others, I can relax. I can focus better. I know what to expect. I'm not stressed out trying to create something. I know it's there. The structure is there, and I can do my job more peacefully, and probably better.
Great. Karen, what about you?
I think one of the things that I've learned is that when I have strong boundaries in place and are honoring those boundaries, I feel like a much more capable, competent professional.
Mhm.
When those boundaries get really diffuse and I'm trying to be all things to all people, I feel like I'm not doing anything well. And that is not a comfortable place to live.
Yeah. I'll add, for me, what I saw on an organizational level was the trust and the respect that the MDT gave when really healthy boundaries were set up. So they could trust what the rules were with case criteria. Then they found that other things we were doing made us more credible, right? So when forensic interviewers, like you mentioned, Andrea, were saying, well, that's not really a great question, but it helped me figure out what you need to know. So when there was that pushback a little bit, the team began to trust and respect and found credible what those boundaries were that we were putting in place. So I think that really helped elevate the whole process in a manner that let our children and families be served better by having those boundaries in place. Great. This has all been fantastic. The one thing I'd love for us to end on is one tool or tip that you implemented or utilized in the professional world that we can share with others so that maybe they can start practicing those skills too. And Karen, we'll start with you on this one.
I think a couple of things. One is the more work I do for myself around what are my top priorities, what do I need to be focused on that if I'm not focusing on, they're not going to get done, or, that are mine and mine alone. When I get really clear about that, and that's kind of the metric that I'm using to determine what goes on my calendar, then things are going better. So it's a lot of that, my own self-reflection, or when I'm feeling overextended or I've put too much on my calendar. What's underneath that? What were you hustling for your own value and worth there, Karen? Were you what's going on internally? It at the end of the day, I can either have clear boundaries and honor those boundaries, or I'm the one that allow people to step over those boundaries. So I think that's true. The other thing is accountability partners. When I have a team around me that's willing to challenge me on some things that I might be, oh, Karen, is that a shiny object? Then things go. So having some accountability and people in it with me is also very helpful.
Great. Yeah, those are great tips. Andrea, what about you? What are some tips you want to leave for the field?
Oh, I'm sitting here thinking, what do I have to add? For me, and I'm looking at this from a very personal viewpoint as, a frontline worker, but then also an instructor, and, the privilege I've had over the years to work with other interviewers. But I think in order to be in this field long term, that you have to honor who you are as an individual, that you are not your work, that those are two separate entities. And if you find yourself constantly taking work home, or you find yourself not spending time with your family or your friends, or you don't have time for your own interests and hobbies, then that's when it becomes problematic. So it's just, to me, it's about not letting your work define you, but to be something outside of your work.
Yeah, that's a great one. And that one takes time to learn if you don't have it in the beginning. So I think with that, give yourself grace to learn that too.
Yeah.
Yeah. Greg, what about you?
Well, I share Karen's thoughts on working that calendar. I know that if I want to feel like I have time to myself, I've got to protect that time. So looking out in advance, blocking time that I want to hold on to has been a really helpful tip for me. The other thing that I've done lately that I've realized is I've stopped apologizing in emails. I can't tell you how many emails started with "sorry for not responding sooner," even if it was a day later. I was setting unhealthy expectations, right? Those are my boundaries. They don't know what my schedule's like. I can just hold on to that and be okay with that as my boundary. Third thing I do lately, a lot more than I've ever had before, is rely on my team. I've got great teammates around me. So asking for help, delegating things that other people can do better than I can do has been really, really helpful in setting those clear boundaries for myself.
Yeah, great. All right, Jimmy, what you got?
I think a tool that I like to use is just good, open, clear communication. If I'm meeting new people or I'm working with someone that maybe I normally don't work with, I think that really comes to mind. Just having a conversation, what's your workday like, or what are your expectations? What are your boundaries? Let me share with you some of mine. I also tell people very directly that I'm good with receiving feedback, constructive feedback, critical feedback, positive, glorious feedback, right? That I'm always open to hearing that. And I want to know how I can provide other people with feedback. Do I need to be aware of a certain, a delivery method or timing? How to do that in a way that's respectful so we can learn each other's boundaries as we go along. I've had great success with that. I've had some failures with that. I mean, every person is different. I learned from that, and then I just try to incorporate that back into this practice of communicating boundaries with others.
Yeah. Yeah, I think just putting it on the table, right? Being willing to have the conversation, ask the questions, be curious about other people's boundaries as well, as I think is a really good one of understanding where they're coming from and why they might be behaving, acting, responding in a certain way. They probably have boundaries that represent themselves as well. So I think these tips and tools are great. I think the conversation's been really hopeful. What I've loved about our conversation throughout is we have this real nice thread of hope that even though boundary setting can be difficult, they're not impossible. And in the end, it will really wind you up in a place to be more healthy and positive and be sustainable in the field. So we're going to link some resources to the bottom of this video. We'll provide Dr. Fisher's resources in there. We'll drop Brian Miller's resources in regards to his supervision. There's an NASW has a really good guide on setting and maintaining boundaries in the social work field, which can be very helpful. And then there's a book called Boundaries, When to Say Yes and How to Say No to Take Control of Your Life by Dr. Henry Cloud. We'll drop that in the bottom too. And as always, if you're ever curious about boundaries, talk to your peers, your mentors, your supervisors, your state chapter directors, your regional folks, anyone that you can get your hands on, because I'm sure they'd be willing to talk about boundaries more. So thank you all for joining us for this conversation, and stay tuned on the SRCAC social media for other tips on boundary settings. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.